government securities and how they have been trading on the primary market and on the secondary market. Though we did not look at the secondary market performance before we went into the break. So let's first have a look at the secondary market, and I will explain later on to some of the qualifications that you need to be on either the primary market or the secondary market of trading. Now, when you look at the secondary market activity, the value of government bonds traded on the secondary market increased by 67.4%. We're talking about the value of the government bonds traded on the secondary market. And as I said, when the banks, for example, the primary dealers, that is Stanbic Bank, UBA, you're looking at people like Standard Chartered, Absa Bank, Bank of Baroda, and so many others. 8 of them, not so many though. These go onto the secondary market as treasury bonds and bills. So if you want to get one of these instruments, you go to your primary dealer, and you're supposed to first of all have an account with that bank. And when you go to this primary dealer, even Centenary Bank, by the way, is one of the primary dealers we have. When you go to these primary dealers, they will give you these treasury bonds, but on what we call the secondary market. Now, we are saying the value of government bonds that are traded on the secondary market increased by over 67.4%. And this was to over 16.2 trillion Ugandan shillings. We're talking about trillions of money here worth of investments. And this was from 9.7 trillion Ugandan shillings in the first quarter. Now, this was a very drastic change. There was a very sharp increase in the value of the government bonds on the secondary market. Average monthly turnover also grew to about 5.4 trillion Ugandan shillings in the review period, from 3.2 million Ugandan trillion shillings. And then additionally, the government bond turnover ratio for the second quarter of 2022 stood at 68.8% compared to 43.6% in the first quarter of 2022. Now, the growth in the turnover can be attributed to, among other things, increased investor appetite for government securities and primary dealership reforms. So because many people, during this time there was inflation, people could no longer trust the equities as well. The equities were performing very poorly. So people tended to shift into the government securities during this particular quarter, the second quarter of 2022. So we see that the turnover also went up very significantly during this period. Now, on the annualized basis, the government bond turnover on the secondary market has increased by 31.7% from about 12.3 trillion Ugandan shillings to over, that's in the second quarter of 2021, to over 16.2 trillion today. So you're seeing a 31.7% growth in the turnover as well on the secondary market. The increase is in turnover can be attributed to, among other things, improved investor appetite for government securities and primary dealership reforms there as well. Now, when you look at the growth in the quarterly secondary market activity or market trading of government bonds, you're looking at a growth that is very significant. When you look at that curve, the curve goes upwards up to 2021, the second quarter, at a 12.28 trillion, and then even much higher right now at a 16.2 trillion Ugandan shillings. So meaning there has been a growth that has been registered in the number of investors as well as in the turnover on this secondary market of treasury bonds. Now, proceeding with some of the things that we look at mainly as we try to see that we invest. Now, the investors wishing to participate in the treasury bills and treasury bonds transactions must be registered, number one, on the Central Securities Depository System, or what we call the CSD. Now, we have the SCD, that is the Securities Central Depository that system that is on the Uganda Securities Exchange. And it's basically for buying and selling shares. That's where we keep our boats shares. And when you come to the government securities, at the moment there are two different systems. But of course there's a view that says why don't we merge these two systems into one, so that whether I'm buying stock, whether I'm buying government securities, I have all these on one account. That's still under debate. But at the moment, we have two systems. The Securities Central Depository System, that is the SCD system, and the Central Securities Depository for the government securities. Now, an investor registers by filling forms. There are several forms that you have to fill. There is CSD Form 1, CSD Form 7, CSD Form 9A/B. There's CSD Form 8 if an organization. And there's also CSD Dealing Agreement, all available on the Bank of Uganda website if you want to find more of these forms that you would want to register with. Now, the forms must be routed through a primary dealer or a PD bank for endorsement before the Central Securities Depository account is opened at the Bank of Uganda. So you fill these forms and take them to your primary dealer. That is the banks I've mentioned. There are 8 banks: Baroda, DFCU Bank, Centenary Bank, Absa Bank. You have UBA, or United Bank for Africa. You also have Housing Finance Bank right now. And you have, I've mentioned DFCU. You have Centenary Bank as well. And yes, you have one other bank that I've mentioned, Standard Chartered. Yes, Standard Chartered Bank. These are some of the primary dealers through which you must go after signing these forms and open yourself an SCD account, a CSD account later at Bank of Uganda. Now, only registered participants are eligible to submit bids in auctions, and that there are 2 categories of investors or bids during the auctions. Now, the Bank of Uganda has an auction where they invite the primary dealers, they invite the public to come and actually bid or ask for these instruments or securities at specific rates. And there are 2 kinds of bidders that we have. We have the non-competitive investors and the competitive investors. When we talk about competitive investors, we're talking about those investors that have 200 million and above for investing. Yes, so if you want to be among the competitive bidders or competitive investors, you must have 200 million shillings and above. And when you look at the non-competitive investors, those are investors whose bids range from, like I said, 100,000 to 200 million. Now, all bids, competitive and non-competitive, must be submitted through a commercial bank who appoints a primary dealer bank. So, if you go to any commercial bank in Uganda, so long as that bank is licensed, and we have about 26 banks in Uganda at the moment, you go to this bank, and at the bank you ask for, I want to maybe buy a treasury bond or a treasury bill. They will have to select a primary dealer if they are not a primary dealer, okay? Or even if they are, they could choose another primary dealer for whatsoever reason, but they have to go through a primary dealer. Now, the primary dealers are well capitalized financial institutions that have an undertaking with the central bank to facilitate the open market operations, as well as the conduit for marketing, for market making. There are 8 primary dealers, like I've already mentioned: Baroda, Absa, DFCU, Standard Chartered, we have Centenary Bank, Housing Finance Bank, and United Bank for Africa. Now, bids are captured on the Central Securities Depository System, and this is by commercial banks for themselves or for their clients. And the auction is carried out at Bank of Uganda. Comprehensive and thorough verification for captured bids is done before the results are approved on the Central Securities Depository. Now, diarization is done on the RTGS system, and for the next days, automatic settlement for the securities at 12 o'clock. Now, when you talk about the RTGS system, we are talking about real-time gross system, real-time and gross system. So the real-time in there means that the bids actually happen in real time. There is a specific period of time within which they happen, and it is real time, meaning it happens there and then. And then it also means that once the payments have been made, they are irrevocable. You cannot reverse the repayment, okay? And so you must take note of that. And then the gross settlement, of course, meaning that you have the entire amount going to one specific product. If it's a treasury bill, it will only go to that treasury bill. You cannot have one transaction having a treasury bill, a treasury bond, or other mixed up products. You only have one product to choose from. Now, settlement. The Bank of Uganda applies a T+1 settlement agreement, and all successful bids are settled by directly debiting the primary dealer or commercial bank accounts at the central bank for the value of the cost of the securities of the investments through a particular primary dealer or commercial bank. So the Bank of Uganda definitely gets to debit those accounts that have been successful. For the successful bidders, their accounts are debited or through either the primary dealer or the commercial bank, which is dealing with the primary dealer. Now, securities are automatically created at the Central Securities Depository after settlement through the real-time gross settlement at 12 o'clock on a settlement day. And Bank of Uganda issues electronic securities that are also stored electronically. So we no longer have papers that were issued before to show that you have a bond or a bill that has been issued. Now, pre-auction procedures. We have some procedures people take. The public is given 7 days or 14 days for the bonds, 7 days for the bills, notice of the bank's intention to auction treasury bills or bonds through one or two of the leading newspapers and via the Bank of Uganda website, as well as an email to the main market participants. So if you read papers, you will always find those pages where you have a notice from Bank of Uganda, and usually this is a bid, or usually it's not very large, a very small box where you have a bid. And here an auction call. The Bank of Uganda is calling the public or primary dealers to actually say, hey, in the next 2 weeks, that's for a bond, or in the next 7 days, we are going to issue a bond, or we are going to issue a bill, a treasury bill. So that's the way people get notified. Or you can visit the Bank of Uganda website to get this information. You can say www.bankofuganda.com, and you will see a list of these, if at all they are yet to be auctioned on the Bank of Uganda website. Now, all the bids must be submitted through primary dealers except for commercial bank bids. Now, if you're an individual, you must go through a primary dealer, but for commercial banks, they can go directly. So for commercial banks, they can directly go to the auction, but for you and me, we are represented by our primary dealers. So you will never find yourself at Bank of Uganda probably for an auction. You have to go through your primary dealer or your commercial banks. The general rules are very simple. All investors must be registered on the Central Securities Depository. That is one requirement, like I mentioned. And all bids must be delivered through a primary dealer. That's another very stringent condition. And then a bidder cannot place both competitive and non-competitive bids in a single tenor of a government security. So you cannot be a non-competitive dealer and a competitive investor as well. So you must choose, am I going to be competitive, that is 200 million and above, or I'm going to be non-competitive between 100,000 and 200 million. Now, a maximum of 4 competitive bids is allowed for each tenor. So you can have more than one bid, but it must be within the limit of 4. That is the maximum. And the bid volumes, we have the minimum bid volume at 100,000 Ugandan shillings, and the bids must be in multiples of 100,000. So you have a bid at 100,000, you have a bid at 200,000, a bid at 300,000, and so on. That's on the primary market. Strictly, that's how it runs. You don't have any in-betweens, 150, 118, no. You have 100, 200, 300,000, and so on and so forth for the bids. Bank of Uganda has no limit to high volume bids, that is dominance by a single investor. So there's no really limit. You can invest as much money as you feel like, as long as it's within the categorized bond or bill. The bid volumes range between 100,000 and 200,000, classified as non-competitive. We have already mentioned that. And then bids volumes as high as 200,100,000 are classified as competitive for that matter. The bid pricing, non-competitive bids are not priced, whereas competitive bids must be priced with prices expressed as per 100 shillings in or in yields and correct to 3 decimal places. And the auctioning procedure, you find it still here on the website. You see that receiving bids on day 1, on the auction day, you receive bids into the Central Securities Depository at exactly 10 a.m. and auctioning starts immediately. And then after, there's a capture and verification of the bids. You look at the bids that have been submitted, and then the non-competitive bids are awarded before the competitive bids, which compete for the remaining volumes. The competitive bids are awarded ranking from the lowest to the highest yield until the offer volume is exhausted. The awarding process will stop at the point where the offered volume is attained. Now, the awarding process will stop exactly at that point when we have the entire volume attained of the bond. Now, rejection of bids. Of course, some bids are rejected. Now, the Bank of Uganda reserves the right to actually reject any or all the bids if it deems it unnecessary, if it deems it necessary, in the interest of the remaining stable rates in the financial market. Bids may also be rejected if the auction rules stipulated above are breached, and also a bid is established to be an outlier. If you're an outlier, you're also rejected. A bid is also rejected if it is construed to be speculative as well. Yes, so briefly, that's what happens there on the auctioning day and the auctioning procedure. We also have failure for settlement. A bank is deemed to have failed to settle if by the time the real-time and gross settlement system instructions are sent out, there are no sufficient funds to settle the dealer's or obligation arising out of the auction. In the current RTGS CSD setup, this would occur when there are insufficient funds on the bank's account at around 12 o'clock on the settlement day. Failure to settle is punishable by first of all, a mandatory default surcharge, which is a number of percentage points of the payable amount or cost of the security, and the suspension of the defaulting bank from a number of future government securities auctions as the Bank of Uganda may determine. So briefly, that is the procedure. I know it's kind of strenuous, but it is worth it. I'm telling you, it's very much worth it. These yields come in every after 6 months for the treasury bonds, and for the treasury bills, they come in at the end of the maturity of the period, because you have the maturity period. So because you have a very short time to hold these financial instruments. You're looking at 3 months, you're looking at 6 months, and 12 months maximum for the treasury bills. But for the treasury bonds, you're looking at much longer periods: 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10, 15, and 20 years. So you're not expecting that yield to come in within the 10 years. You're expecting at least something to come in at least every after 6 months or so. And since the rate is annual, to get exactly the amount of money you'll be earning every 6 months, you get that rate and divide it into 2. Now, when you divide that rate into 2, you will get exactly the percentage of the money that you will be getting every 6 months that pass, as long as you hold that security. Now, since we have a secondary market for these securities, that is where we have transferability, and that's where the game gets a little bit much more fair. And so if you don't want to wait until the 10 years have expired, if you don't want to wait until 20 years, you can transfer this bond to somebody else. And this is as simple as getting to trade on the secondary market. And it's very important for you to understand that before you buy the instrument, because some people don't understand that these debts are transferable. They are transferable. You don't have to hold it all the way till the end of the maturity, or till maturity of the instrument, but you can transfer it from one person to another. And this is the beauty, really, of the entire market concept here on the exchange. And so I've just given you exactly what you needed to know. You can make more research on your own, visiting the website of Bank of Uganda. Get to find out what bonds are available right now. With just 100,000, you can start your journey of investment on the government securities. We're going to take another very short breather. When we return, we look at the stock market and analyze it deeply. And later on, we'll also look at Nairobi, what happened on their exchange, and some of the top stories in the financial markets world. Stay with us. We'll be right back.